What if I told you that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the very thing that saves your life? What if being humiliated, embarrassed, and kicked out of where you thought you belonged was actually the universe protecting you from something far worse? This is the story of Marcus Thompson, a 17-year-old who thought his biggest problem was being thrown out of first class on Flight 447. He had no idea that in just 47 minutes, that same plane would become the center of an international crisis that would make headlines around the world. Sometimes what feels like the end of everything is actually the beginning of the most important story you'll ever tell. What happened next would change not just Marcus's life, but the lives of everyone on board that plane, and teach the world that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they're just teenagers who refuse to give up when everything goes wrong. Marcus Thompson had never felt smaller in his entire 17 years of life than he did standing in the aisle of Flight 447, watching the flight attendant's perfectly painted lips form words that felt like daggers to his chest. His hand shook slightly as he held his boarding pass, the paper now crumpled from his nervous grip, while nearly 200 passengers turned their heads to stare at the commotion unfolding in first class. The morning had started so differently. Marcus woke up in his small bedroom in Detroit, the same bedroom he'd had since he was 7, with its faded superhero posters and the desk where he spent countless hours studying. Today was supposed to be the beginning of everything he'd worked for. The National Youth Science Competition finals in Los Angeles represented 4 years of dedication, late nights in the school lab, and dreams of a scholarship that would change his family's entire future. His mother, Sarah, had saved every penny from her 2 jobs, as a nurse's aide and weekend house cleaner, to buy him that first-class ticket. She wanted her son to arrive in California feeling confident and important, not cramped in the back of the plane like some economy passenger. The ticket cost more than their monthly grocery budget, but Sarah Thompson believed her son deserved to feel special, at least once. Marcus remembered the pride in his mother's eyes when she handed him the boarding pass 3 days earlier. Her hands, permanently stained with cleaning chemicals and rough from years of hard work, trembled with excitement as she told him this was his moment to shine. She had worked double shifts for 2 months to afford not just the ticket, but also the new suit, hanging in his closet, and the scientific calculator he'd been wanting for years. The security line at Detroit Metropolitan Airport moved slowly that Tuesday morning, giving Marcus time to review his presentation notes one final time. His project on sustainable energy solutions using algae biofuel had already won at the state level, beating competitors from schools with million-dollar science programs and equipment he could only dream about. His research was conducted in the basement of Lincoln High School, using equipment donated by local businesses and his own creativity to build what he couldn't afford to buy. When Marcus finally reached the gate, he felt a surge of nervous energy mixed with genuine excitement. The gate agent, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, smiled at him as she scanned his boarding pass. She noticed the first-class designation and the young face that seemed almost surprised to be holding such a ticket. Her expression softened as she handed back his pass and wished him luck on whatever important journey had earned him such special treatment. The plane itself was impressive to Marcus, who had only flown twice before, both times in the very back row with his knees pressed against the seat in front of him. The first-class cabin looked like something from a movie, with wide leather seats that could recline almost flat, and flight attendants offering warm towels and orange juice in actual glass cups instead of plastic. Marcus settled into Seat 3A, carefully placing his backpack with his presentation materials in the overhead compartment and his small carry-on bag at his feet. For the first 20 minutes after boarding, everything felt perfect. Marcus accepted the pre-flight orange juice, marveled at the legroom, and even managed to strike up a conversation with the businessman in the seat next to him. Mr. Raker. Peterson was a patent attorney who seemed genuinely interested in Marcus's algae research and offered his business card, suggesting they stay in touch about potential commercial applications. The problems began when a well-dressed woman in her 50s approached his seat, holding her own boarding pass and looking confused. Mrs. Victoria Sterling, as she would later introduce herself, was a frequent first-class traveler who held platinum status with the airline and had never experienced a seating conflict in over 20 years of flying. She examined her boarding pass carefully, then looked at Marcus with an expression that gradually shifted from confusion to irritation. The flight attendant, Jennifer Walsh, had been working for the airline for 8 years and prided herself on maintaining order and protocol in her cabin. When Mrs. Sterling called her over to resolve what appeared to be a simple seating mix-up, Jennifer assumed it would be a quick fix involving a computer error or duplicate seat assignment. She approached Marcus's seat with professional courtesy, asking to see his boarding pass and identification. Marcus handed over his documents without concern, confident that everything was in order. His mother had checked and double-checked every detail of his reservation, and he had confirmed his seat assignment during online check-in the night before. But when Jennifer examined his boarding pass more closely, her expression changed. She excused herself and walked to the front of the cabin to make a phone call, speaking in hushed tones that Marcus couldn't quite hear, but that made his stomach begin to knot with worry. The conversation at the front of the cabin lasted nearly 10 minutes, with Jennifer speaking first to someone at the gate, then to what appeared to be a supervisor, and finally to someone from the airline's customer service department. Marcus watched her face grow more serious with each call, occasionally glancing back at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. The other first-class passengers began to notice the delay, checking their watches and shifting impatiently in their seats. When Jennifer finally returned to his row, she was accompanied by the captain himself, a distinguished man in his 50s, who introduced himself as Captain Rodriguez. The captain's presence in the cabin immediately heightened the tension, and Marcus felt every eye in first class turning toward him. Captain Rodriguez asked to speak with Marcus privately, but in the confined space of the airplane, privacy was impossible. The explanation, when it finally came, hit Marcus like a physical blow. There had been an error with his mother's credit card payment. The transaction had initially been approved, but the card had been declined during the final processing phase 3 days after purchase. The airline system had failed to catch the error immediately, allowing Marcus to complete online check-in and even board the plane. But now, 35,000 feet above ground, the payment failure had finally been flagged in their system. Marcus felt his face burn with embarrassment as he tried to explain that his mother would never have sent him on the trip if she couldn't afford the ticket. He offered to call her immediately to provide additional payment information, to do whatever was necessary to resolve the situation. But airline policy was clear and inflexible. A declined payment meant an invalid ticket, and an invalid ticket meant removal from the premium cabin, regardless of the circumstances or the passenger's age. The whispered conversations around him grew louder as other passengers began to realize what was happening. Marcus caught fragments of their comments, some sympathetic, others judgmental. An elderly woman in the row behind him muttered something about people flying above their means, while a young couple across the aisle shook their heads sympathetically at what they clearly saw as an embarrassing mistake. Mrs. Sterling, whose seat assignment had triggered the entire investigation, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and discomfort. She had simply wanted to claim her assigned seat, but she hadn't anticipated that resolving the conflict would result in such public humiliation for a teenager who was clearly traveling alone. As Marcus gathered his belongings under the watchful eyes of nearly 50 first-class passengers, Mrs. Sterling found herself wishing she had simply chosen a different seat rather than insist on the one printed on her boarding pass. The walk from first class to the back of the plane felt like the longest journey of Marcus's life. Every step took him past rows of passengers who had witnessed his removal, their expressions ranging from curiosity to pity to barely concealed amusement. His face burned with shame as he carried his backpack and small bag down the narrow aisle, flight attendants and passengers stepping aside to let him pass while maintaining the kind of polite distance usually reserved for contagious diseases. His new seat was 32F, a middle seat in the very back row of the plane, wedged between a crying infant and a man whose snoring had been audible even during boarding. The contrast between his original first-class experience and his current situation couldn't have been more dramatic. Instead of leather and legroom, he found himself squeezed into a fabric seat with barely enough space to open his laptop. The businessman's business card, still clutched in his hand, now felt like a mockery of his earlier optimism. As Marcus settled into his new seat, trying to make himself as small as possible to avoid disturbing his fellow passengers, he couldn't shake the feeling that everyone on the plane was still staring at him. The infant next to him continued crying, and the man on his other side had already fallen back asleep, leaving Marcus trapped in the middle with nowhere to escape the emotional weight of what had just happened. The flight attendants, perhaps feeling guilty about the public nature of his removal, offered him extra snacks and checked on him frequently during the first hour of flight. But their kindness, while well-intentioned, only served to remind Marcus of his changed circumstances and the embarrassing scene that had preceded them. He spent the first part of the flight staring out the small window, watching the landscape below, and wondering how he would explain this humiliation to the competition organizers who were expecting him to arrive in Los Angeles. His presentation materials, safely stored in his backpack, seemed heavier now, weighted with the knowledge that his confidence had been shaken before he even arrived at the competition. Marcus had spent months preparing for this moment, imagining how he would feel walking into the convention center in Los Angeles, ready to present his research to judges and fellow competitors from across the country. Now he wondered if the embarrassment of the morning would affect his performance, if the other competitors would somehow sense that he didn't belong among them. The next few hours of the flight passed slowly, with Marcus alternating between reviewing his notes and staring out the window, trying to process what had happened and prepare himself mentally for the competition that awaited him in California. He had no way of knowing that his removal from first class, as humiliating as it felt in the moment, was about to become the least significant event of what would prove to be an extraordinary and life-changing day. 2 hours into the flight, Marcus had finally managed to push aside his embarrassment enough to focus on his presentation materials. He pulled out his laptop and began reviewing the slides he had worked on for months, each one representing countless hours of research and experimentation, in the makeshift laboratory he had created in his high school's basement. His algae biofuel project wasn't just an academic exercise for him, it represented a potential solution to real-world energy problems, and more personally, a pathway to the kind of future his family had never been able to imagine. The man sitting next to him in the window seat had introduced himself as Dr. Bright, James Hoffman, a chemistry professor from UCLA who was returning from a conference in Detroit. Dr. Hoffman had noticed Marcus's scientific materials and, with the natural curiosity of an academic, had struck up a conversation about the young man's research. Unlike the brief interaction Marcus had experienced in first class, this conversation developed into something deeper and more meaningful. Dr. Hoffman was genuinely impressed by the sophistication of Marcus's work, particularly given the limited resources available at Lincoln High School. The professor had visited the school once for a community outreach program and remembered the outdated science equipment and cramped laboratory facilities. That someone could conduct graduate-level research in such conditions spoke to both natural talent and extraordinary determination. As Marcus explained his methodology for cultivating specific algae strains and optimizing their oil production, Dr. Marcus Huffman found himself taking notes. The conversation might have continued for the remainder of the flight, but it was interrupted by something that initially seemed like nothing more than an inconvenience. Marcus noticed that his laptop screen was flickering slightly, displaying occasional horizontal lines that suggested either a hardware malfunction or interference from some external source. At first, he assumed it was simply the result of the laptop's age and the countless hours of use it had endured during his research. But as the flickering continued and seemed to intensify, Marcus began to notice other electronic devices throughout the cabin were experiencing similar problems. The passenger across the aisle was tapping her tablet screen with increasing frustration, trying to get it to respond properly. A businessman 2 rows ahead was staring at his smartphone with confusion, apparently unable to get it to maintain a stable connection. Even the aircraft's own entertainment system seemed to be experiencing intermittent glitches. Dr. Hoffman, who had been using his own laptop to show Marcus some related research papers, noticed the interference pattern as well. His academic background included some work with electromagnetic fields, and the nature of the electronic disruptions struck him as unusual for typical airline interference. Commercial aircraft were designed to shield against most forms of electronic interference, and passengers were routinely allowed to use their devices during flight without experiencing the kinds of systematic problems that seemed to be affecting multiple systems simultaneously. Marcus, whose scientific training had taught him to observe patterns and ask questions, began to pay closer attention to the electronic disturbances around him. He noticed that the interference seemed to follow a pattern, intensifying and diminishing in regular cycles rather than occurring randomly. Using his phone's stopwatch function, he began timing the intervals and discovered that the disruptions occurred approximately every 12 minutes, lasting for roughly 90 seconds each time. The pattern was too regular to be coincidental and too widespread to be caused by a single malfunctioning device. Marcus mentioned his observations to Dr. Hoffman, who became increasingly interested in what appeared to be a systematic electromagnetic interference affecting the entire aircraft. Together, they began documenting the timing and intensity of each occurrence, creating an informal scientific record of whatever was causing the electronic disruptions. During the third documented occurrence of interference, Marcus noticed something else that made his stomach drop. The aircraft's cabin lighting flickered slightly during the peak of the electronic disruption, suggesting that whatever was causing the interference was powerful enough to affect not just passenger devices, but potentially the airplane's own electrical systems. The thought was terrifying, but Marcus forced himself to remain calm and continue his observations. Dr. Hoffman had reached the same conclusion, and was now genuinely concerned about the implications of what they were witnessing. He discreetly tried to get the attention of a flight attendant, but the crew appeared to be dealing with other issues and didn't immediately respond to his call button. The electronic interference was clearly affecting the aircraft's communication systems as well, as evidenced by the flight attendants' increasingly frequent visits to the cockpit and their hushed, urgent conversations. As Marcus continued his documentation, He realized that the interference pattern was not only regular, but was also gradually intensifying. Each cycle seemed slightly stronger than the previous one, suggesting that whatever was causing the problem was either getting closer to the aircraft or increasing in power. The scientific part of his mind found the phenomenon fascinating, but the rational part was becoming increasingly worried about what it might mean for the safety of everyone on board. The fourth cycle of interference was strong enough to cause several passengers' devices to shut down completely, rather than simply experience temporary disruptions. Marcus's laptop screen went completely black for nearly 30 seconds, while Dr. Hoffman's device displayed what appeared to be corrupted data before rebooting itself. The aircraft's entertainment system went offline entirely, leaving passengers staring at blank screens and wondering what was happening. It was during the fifth cycle that Marcus made the connection that would change everything. As he watched his laptop screen flicker and recover, he noticed that the interference pattern looked remarkably similar to something he had seen during his research. While conducting experiments with electromagnetic fields as part of his algae cultivation process, he had accidentally created interference patterns when his equipment was improperly shielded. The pattern he was observing on the aircraft matched what he had seen when high-powered radio equipment was being used in close proximity to sensitive electronic devices. Hoffman listened intently as Marcus explained his theory about the source of the interference. If Marcus was correct, the regular patterns they were observing suggested that someone was operating powerful radio transmission equipment nearby, possibly from the ground or from another aircraft. The implications were troubling, as such equipment could potentially be used for a variety of purposes, not all of them benign. Together, they began to analyze the timing more carefully, using Marcus's documentation to create a more detailed picture of what was happening. The interference was definitely getting stronger, and the intervals between occurrences were gradually shortening. What had started as 12-minute cycles had decreased to approximately 10 minutes, suggesting that the source of the interference was either moving closer to their aircraft or increasing its transmission power. By the time the sixth cycle occurred, other passengers were beginning to notice the electronic problems and express concern about them. The flight attendants were clearly aware that something unusual was happening, as evidenced by their frequent communication with the cockpit and their attempts to reassure passengers that the electronic issues were minor and temporary. But Marcus could see the worry in their eyes, and he knew that his own documentation painted a more serious picture than the crew was willing to admit publicly. Dr. Matham. Hoffman suggested that they should try to communicate their findings to the flight crew, but the question was how to do so without causing panic among the other passengers. They needed to convey the seriousness of their observations, while also acknowledging that they could be wrong about the implications. The last thing anyone wanted was to create unnecessary alarm based on what might turn out to be a harmless electronic malfunction. As they debated the best course of action, the seventh cycle of interference occurred, and this time it was strong enough to affect the aircraft's cabin lighting noticeably. The lights dimmed and flickered for several seconds, causing murmurs of concern throughout the cabin. Marcus noticed that even the emergency lighting system seemed to be affected, which suggested that whatever was causing the interference was incredibly powerful. The pattern of intensification was accelerating, with cycles now occurring every 8 minutes and lasting for nearly 2 minutes each time. Marcus's scientific training told him that if the trend continued, the interference would eventually become strong enough to affect critical aircraft systems. The thought was terrifying, but he knew that his observations might be the key to understanding and potentially addressing whatever was happening. Dr. Hoffman made the decision to approach a flight attendant directly, despite the risk of being dismissed as an overly concerned passenger. He carefully explained that he was a university professor and that his young companion had been documenting what appeared to be systematic electromagnetic interference that was intensifying over time. The flight attendant, Jennifer Walsh, was the same one who had been involved in Marcus's removal from first class earlier in the flight. Hoffman's explanation with growing concern, particularly when he showed her Marcus's careful documentation of the interference patterns. She had been wondering about the electronic issues herself and had noticed that the cockpit crew seemed increasingly worried about something they weren't sharing with the cabin crew. The possibility that a passenger had identified the source of the problems was both alarming and potentially valuable. After consulting with her supervisor, Jennifer agreed to take Dr. Academy, Hoffman and Marcus to speak with the captain directly. As they walked toward the front of the aircraft, 6 months after Flight 447 made its emergency landing in Las Vegas, Marcus Thompson stood in the Rose Garden of the White House, wearing the same suit his mother had bought for the National Youth Science Competition that he never got to attend. This time, however, he wasn't presenting his algae biofuel research to a panel of science teachers. He was receiving the Presidential Citizens Medal for his role in uncovering and helping to prevent what investigators had determined was a coordinated cyber attack on American aviation infrastructure. The investigation that had begun with Marcus's careful documentation of electromagnetic interference had ultimately led to the identification and arrest of a sophisticated international cybercrime organization with connections to hostile foreign intelligence services. The group had been systematically probing American aviation security systems, gathering intelligence for what appeared to be preparation for a large-scale terrorist attack designed to ground commercial aviation and cause mass casualties through coordinated electronic warfare attacks. President Katherine Williams, as she presented Marcus with the medal, explained to the gathered audience of security officials, scientists, and media representatives how a teenager's scientific curiosity and careful observation had helped protect the American aviation system from one of the most sophisticated cyber threats it had ever faced. The president noted that Marcus's story demonstrated how ordinary citizens with the right training and awareness could play crucial roles in national security. Marcus's mother, Sarah Thompson, stood in the front row of the audience, tears streaming down her face as she watched her son receive recognition from the President of the United States. The woman who had worked double shifts to buy her son a first-class airline ticket that he couldn't ultimately use now, watched him being honored for his contribution to national security. The irony of the situation was not lost on either of them. His removal from first class had been the catalyst for everything that followed. Dr. B. Hoffman, who had become something of a mentor to Marcus during the investigation, was also present at the ceremony. The UCLA professor had been instrumental in helping Marcus understand the broader implications of his observations and had worked with him to present their findings in a way that government investigators could understand and act upon. Their partnership had evolved into a formal research collaboration that was producing groundbreaking work in cybersecurity and electromagnetic warfare detection. The ceremony at the White House was just one of many recognitions Marcus had received in the months following the Flight 447 incident. MIT had offered him a full scholarship for early admission to their electrical engineering program, while Stanford had created a special research position that would allow him to continue his work on both renewable energy and cybersecurity applications. The teenager who had worried about affording college now had his choice of the most prestigious universities in the country. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition had come from his own community in Detroit. Lincoln High School had named their new science laboratory the Marcus Thompson Research Center, funded by donations from technology companies and government agencies that had been impressed by his work. The laboratory was equipped with state-of-the-art electromagnetic research equipment that would allow future students to conduct the kind of advanced research that Marcus had only been able to dream about during his own high school years. The investigation had also revealed the full scope of how close the cyber attack had come to succeeding. The electronic warfare system that had targeted Flight 447 was one of 12 similar systems across the country that had been compromised by the cybercrime organization. If Marcus had not identified the interference patterns and helped investigators understand their significance, the attackers might have successfully coordinated simultaneous attacks on commercial aviation that could have killed thousands of people and paralyzed air travel for months. FBI Special Agent Lisa Martinez, who had led the investigation, spoke at the White House ceremony about the importance of citizen vigilance and scientific literacy in protecting national security. She explained how Marcus's documentation had provided investigators with the crucial evidence they needed to trace the cyber attack back to its source and prevent the larger attack that was being planned. Agent Martinez noted that traditional security measures might not have detected the threat until it was too late to prevent the coordinated attack. The international cybercrime organization responsible for the attacks had been operating for several years, systematically infiltrating electronic warfare and aviation security systems while gathering intelligence about their vulnerabilities. Marcus's observations had disrupted their operations at a crucial moment, when they were conducting final tests before launching their coordinated attack on American aviation infrastructure. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the electromagnetic warfare expert who had worked with Marcus during the investigation, had become so impressed with his analytical abilities that she had recruited him to join her research team at the Department of Defense. Marcus would be working part-time while completing his college education, contributing to the development of new detection systems designed to identify and counter electronic warfare attacks on civilian infrastructure. The technology that Marcus helped develop, based on his observations of the Flight 447 incident, was now being implemented at airports across the country. The electromagnetic interference detection systems could identify suspicious electronic activity and automatically alert security personnel to potential cyber attacks on aviation systems. The systems had already prevented several attempts by other cybercrime organizations to probe aviation security vulnerabilities. Marcus's experience had also led to changes in how airlines handle electronic interference incidents. Flight crews were now trained to recognize the patterns that Marcus had identified, and passengers were being educated about the importance of reporting unusual electronic behavior during flights. The aviation industry had learned that some of their most valuable security assets might be scientifically trained passengers who knew what to look for. The National Youth Science Competition had invited Marcus to serve as a special guest speaker at their annual awards ceremony, where he addressed an audience of young scientists about the importance of observation, documentation, and scientific thinking in solving real-world problems. His presentation on how his algae biofuel research had prepared him to recognize electromagnetic interference patterns became one of the most requested talks at science education conferences across the country. But beyond all the recognition and opportunities, the most important change in Marcus's life was his transformed understanding of his own capabilities and potential. The teenager who had felt humiliated and out of place in first class now understood that his background, education, and way of thinking were valuable assets that could contribute to solving important problems. His removal from first class, which had seemed like such a personal failure, had actually positioned him to make one of the most important contributions of his young life. Marcus's story had become a case study taught in cybersecurity programs, emergency management courses, and aviation security training programs. His careful documentation methods were now standard procedure for investigating electronic interference incidents, and his analytical approach had been incorporated into threat detection protocols used by government security agencies. The relationship between Marcus and Dr. Hoffman had evolved into a formal research partnership that was producing influential work in multiple fields. Their collaborative papers on electromagnetic interference detection and cybersecurity threat analysis were being cited by researchers around the world, and they had received funding to establish a new research center focused on protecting civilian infrastructure from electronic warfare attacks. Mrs. Victoria Sterling, the first-class passenger whose seat assignment had triggered Marcus's removal from the premium cabin, had followed his story in the media and eventually reached out to apologize for her role in what had seemed like such an embarrassing incident. She had established a scholarship fund in Marcus's name to help other deserving students afford first-class travel to academic competitions, understanding now that sometimes being in the right place at the right time could change the world. As Marcus stood in the Rose Garden, holding his Presidential Citizen's Medal and thinking about the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this moment, he realized that his mother had been right all along. She had wanted him to feel special and important when she bought that first-class ticket, and while the ticket itself hadn't worked out as planned, the experience had ultimately made him understand just how special and important he truly was. The teenager who had once felt that he didn't belong in first class now understood that he belonged wherever his knowledge, curiosity, and dedication could make a difference. His removal from first class had been the beginning of the most important adventure of his life, leading him to discover not just cyber threats and electromagnetic interference, but his own potential to contribute to something far greater than himself.